Close your eyes. Imagine yourself standing alone in a pitch-dark room. The air is heavy, almost suffocating, and you can feel something watching you from the shadows. Suddenly, a soft whisper brushes against your ear. You shouldn't be here. Before you can turn, an icy hand grips your shoulder. Welcome to the nightmare, where reality twists, shadows speak, and fear isn't just a feeling, it's alive. It all started on a cold December night. I was visiting my cousin in Karachi, and since it was late, I decided to stay in his apartment. The building was old, the kind that creaks with every gust of wind, and had a strange, unsettling vibe. The elevators, ancient and slow, seemed like they belonged in a horror movie. At around 2 a.m., my cousin fell asleep, and I realized I had left my phone charger in my car. Reluctantly, I grabbed the keys and headed to the elevator. As the doors slid open, I noticed something strange. The elevator was spotless, gleaming like it had just been polished. This was odd because the rest of the building was neglected and dusty. Ignoring the oddity, I stepped in. The elevator jolted slightly as it began to descend. The dim light inside flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. As I watched the floor numbers tick down, 4, 3, 2, suddenly, the elevator stopped with a jarring thud. The floor display went blank. I hit the emergency button, but there was no response. Annoyed, I reached for my phone to call for help, only to realize there was no signal. A chill ran down my spine when I noticed the temperature in the elevator had dropped drastically. My breath fogged in front of me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the whisper grew louder, morphing into a guttural voice. It was coming from the speaker above. It said, "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My hands trembled as I hammered the buttons, desperately trying to make the elevator move. Out of nowhere, the lights went out, plunging me into complete darkness. My heart raced, and my breathing became ragged. Then the elevator shuddered violently, as though something heavy had just landed on top of it. The lights flickered back on for a moment, and that's when I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, pressed against the mirrored wall of the elevator. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and its cracked lips twisted into a sinister smile. Before I could scream, the lights went out again. The elevator began to move, but it wasn't going down, it was ascending, faster and faster. The display flickered back to life, but instead of numbers, it showed strange symbols I couldn't understand. The whispering returned, louder this time, and it was all around me. It felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating me. The elevator came to an abrupt halt. The doors slid open and I found myself staring into complete darkness. No hallway, no floors, just an endless void. My instincts screamed at me not to step out, but my body felt paralyzed. A voice, deep and resonant, boomed from the void. "One step forward and you'll never return." At that moment, the elevator shook violently and I was thrown to the floor. The doors closed and the elevator began descending again, this time at a normal pace. When it reached the ground floor, the doors opened and I stumbled out into the lobby. It was empty. The watchman, who was always there, was nowhere to be seen. The air felt thick and the silence was deafening. Gathering my courage, I ran out of the building and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove away that night and never returned to that building. My cousin moved out a month later, claiming he started hearing whispers in his apartment at night. To this day, I don't take elevators alone, because somewhere deep down, I know that what I encountered that night wasn't just my imagination. Something was in that elevator with me, and it's still waiting for the next person foolish enough to step in alone. Hospitals always have an eerie vibe at night, but this one was different. I was a medical intern at a hospital on the outskirts of Lahore, and my shift that night was on the top floor, Ward 13. It was an unused section of the hospital, closed off after a mysterious fire decades ago. They said no one had died in the fire, but everyone whispered stories of strange things happening there. Ward 13 was dimly lit, its long corridors lined with rusted hospital beds and peeling walls. My task was simple: inventory the medical supplies left in the storage room. It was routine work, but the silence in that ward was unsettling. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was trying to absorb the sound. As I walked into the ward, I noticed something odd. A wheelchair was sitting in the middle of the hallway, perfectly aligned, as if someone had just used it. I distinctly remembered that the last time I had come here, it was tucked away in the corner. Shrugging it off, I continued toward the storage room. The door creaked open, revealing rows of dusty shelves. The air smelled of dampness and something faintly metallic. I began counting supplies, trying to focus on the task and ignore the eerie atmosphere. That's when I heard it. A soft thud behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. The wheelchair was now in the doorway, my stomach twisted into knots. I was sure I hadn't heard anyone push it, and yet there it was. Slowly, I approached it, my hands trembling. As I reached out to touch it, a cold breeze brushed past me, sending chills down my spine. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered. In its brief flashes, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a woman in a hospital gown. Her head was tilted to the side, and her long, matted hair obscured her face. I blinked, and she was gone. I stood frozen, unable to move. The silence was deafening now, almost pressing down on me. Gathering what little courage I had, I backed away toward the storage room. But as I turned, I felt a hand grip my arm, cold and bony. I screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The wheelchair was gone. I ran down the hallway, desperate to get to the stairs. As I reached the end, the lights flickered again and the woman reappeared, this time closer. Her face was partially visible now, her pale skin stretched tight over her skull, and her eyes, empty sockets that seemed to pull me in. She raised her arm and pointed at me, her mouth opened wide, wider than humanly possible, and a guttural scream erupted, echoing through the empty ward. I turned and bolted for the stairwell, not daring to look back. The moment I burst into the stairwell, the noise stopped. Everything was silent again. I ran down the stairs, my legs trembling, until I reached the ground floor. The staff at the reception looked at me as if I was insane. When I told them what had happened, their faces turned pale. One of the older nurses pulled me aside and whispered, "You saw her, didn't you? The patient from the fire. She's been here for decades, looking for someone to help her. No one who sees her comes back the same." I quit my internship at that hospital the next day. Even now I avoid hospitals at night, but the memory of that woman still haunts me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the squeak of a wheelchair outside my apartment door. I had always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings. I never believed in any of it. But that night changed everything. It was an ordinary evening when my friends and I decided to explore an old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Rawalpindi. The mansion had been empty for years, a decaying relic of a once grand estate. Stories had circulated about it being haunted, but they were just that, stories. Or so I thought. We arrived just after sunset and the air was thick with fog. The mansion stood ominously at the end of a long, narrow lane, its windows boarded up, its doors hanging off their hinges. The building had a sinister presence, but we were determined to get inside and explore. We made our way through the broken front door and into the vast, decaying foyer. The smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air. Our flashlights flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The house seemed to groan under its own weight, as if it were alive, warning us to leave. But we didn't listen. We explored the ground floor, which was mostly empty, except for broken furniture and shattered glass. It wasn't until we found the staircase that led down into the basement that things began to get strange. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, a deep, almost unnatural cold that made our breaths come out in visible puffs. We descended the stairs cautiously, the floor creaking beneath our feet. The basement was dark, save for the faint glow of our flashlights. And then in the corner of the room we saw it, a large, old-fashioned mirror. It stood against the wall, its wooden frame intricate and ornate, but cracked in several places. What struck us as strange wasn't the mirror itself, but the fact that everything else in the basement seemed to be covered in dust and cobwebs, except for the mirror. It was spotless, almost as if it had been cleaned recently. We approached it, drawn by some strange, unexplainable force. As I stood before it, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear, but there was something more. Behind me, just barely visible in the reflection, was a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The others didn't seem to notice anything, laughing and joking, unaware of the presence I had felt. I was about to turn back to the mirror when I heard a faint whisper, so soft I thought I imagined it. "Come closer." I shook my head, telling myself I was just spooked, but the voice grew louder. Come closer, and you'll see." Compelled by an unseen force, I took a step toward the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, the reflection of the figure became clearer. Its face was pale, its eyes dark pits, and its mouth twisted into an eerie grin. But what sent a jolt of terror through me wasn't the figure's appearance, it was the fact that it was moving. The figure raised its hand and placed it on the mirror, and to my horror, its hand pressed against the glass from the inside, as though it were trapped, struggling to break free. "Let me out!" The voice was no longer a whisper, but a low, desperate cry. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The others were still laughing and chatting, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding behind them. But then the mirror began to shake. It rattled violently on the wall, and the figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, its fingers twisting unnaturally. "Please, help me," it moaned. I turned to run, but something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, looking down to see nothing there. But as I tried to pull away, the air around me grew heavy, and I could feel the pressure building, as if the basement itself was trying to suffocate me. I broke free and ran up the stairs, my friends finally noticing my panic. They didn't believe me when I told them what I saw, laughing it off as a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had experienced. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the figure from the mirror in the corners of my room, its hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. The whispers didn't stop, echoing in my ears, calling me back. I tried to forget about it, but every time I looked in a mirror, I could feel the presence behind me, waiting. It's been weeks since that night, and I've tried to avoid mirrors at all costs. But last night, as I passed by my bedroom mirror, I saw something in the reflection, just for a second. A hand, pale and cracked, pressed against the glass from the other side. I don't know if it's a warning, but I can feel it now. It's coming for me.